welcome to CX Today. My name is Charlie, I'm the senior editor here, and today I'm delighted to be joined by prominent industry analyst and head of Qualtrics XM Institute, Bruce Hempkin. Bruce, it's great to have you join us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing awesome, Charlie. Thanks for having me.
It's really good to speak to you about this, and we have a really exciting report to discuss your 2022 Global Consumer Trends Report. We've pulled 4 trends from that, but before we kind of start digging into those, I was wondering, kind of first off, if you could introduce a little bit kind of about the purpose of this report.
Sure. So XM Institute, we do thought leadership and content along lots of different topics, right? And so periodically we want to get a snapshot of what's happening that's really important. And this particular study is great because we look across 23 countries and really get a sense of the pulse of what consumers are thinking and feeling. And in this particular time, it's fairly interesting, right? Because the last couple of years have been really, really interesting, and I'll put quotes around that. And so we wanted to understand, sort of as we get past hopefully the worst of COVID and all those changes, where consumers' heads are at, especially when it relates to the topics we care about, which is experience management.
Yeah. Excellent. I mean, experience management, as you say, is kind of such a vast field. It's good to kind of have somebody digging into that for us, so we know where to focus. And as I said, you kind of split this report into 4 trends. We're going to discuss each of those just a little bit. And our first trend is that customers have had enough and they're willing to walk away. Do you think this is more of a reflection on changing customer behavior, or is this kind of more to do with perhaps worsening experiences?
Well, I think at this moment it's probably both. If I look at a longer trend, one of the things that we've seen is that by and large, customer feedback scores, customer experience scores, haven't sort of gone up over time, right? But in any type of an absolute sense, experiences are getting better, right? The quality of them, people are focusing on them. So what you see is this interesting trend. One trend is that customers reset their expectations on higher levels of experiences very quickly, right? They get very used to one click ordering from Amazon, and that's their new expectation, right? So we have that going on, right? They reset their expectations higher and higher all the time. I think the second thing is that, we talk about this period in time. The last couple of years, people were willing to give companies the benefit of the doubt. We were all in this sort of COVID world together, right? So we were sort of thankful for any type of experience we had. And because we knew that organizations were challenged to be able to do anything, right? And so I think that the second part of what we're seeing is just that consumers are, after 2 years of giving everyone the benefit of the doubt, I think they're all tired and start becoming more self-focused, and are less likely to give organizations and other companies the benefit of the doubt. So we're sort of getting back into our normal mode of really caring about the experiences that we have and making sure that our needs are getting met.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a kind of very good, concise way to put how the current state of CX is almost. It kind of reminded me of somebody who was talking to me about CX at the moment being kind of a long train. You have Amazon, as you said, maybe at the front pulling it forward. You have loads of people in the middle trying to keep up, and then you have some falling behind. I thought that was quite a nice way to put it. And also, as you said there, the consumer expectations changing since the pandemic, and how we were all in this together. And now perhaps we're resetting, and companies aren't perhaps ready that reset. But I think the next point which really stood out to me within the report, and I find this particularly interesting, is the second trend of tossing out pre-2022 business plans. I just want to kind of get your opinion on why do you think this is happening?
Because it's interesting. I think we'll keep this theme going about like a couple of like interacting trends. So I think that a couple things to keep in mind is that the what happened in COVID is people, no question, the last couple people changed their behaviors, right? Uh, all of us did, right? You don't have to look farther than your own self and your family, right, to see how we all changed our behavior, right? Now, some of those behaviors are going to last and some aren't, right? So we know that happens. So if we just sort of step back and go, okay, just by definition, we know that people aren't going to be the same people they were prior to COVID, right? Because we have both the changes that are permanent, we have changes that were accelerated, and then we have this sort of shift to getting back into normal in some modes. And the example of that I'll give is that, there's been a lot of digital disruption, right? So you see things like, online gyms and exercise stuff, like Peloton became crazy, went wild, right? But now their growth is like being challenged somewhat, right? And so if we just look at that, it doesn't mean that people are going back to the gyms or giving up their Peloton. It's just that this world post-COVID is not exactly like it was pre-COVID there, and it's not exactly like it was during COVID there, right? So we have to think about, just in that one case, what does the exercise world look like post-COVID? And we know it's something different. But like I said, it's not what we saw prior to COVID, and it's not what we saw during COVID. So I think that's a good metaphor, the exercise industry, for just about every industry out there, right? We have to think about the current environment differently than we've had in the past, which means we have to throw out all the plans. We're better off, like if we're trying to say we're going to continue on some path that we were doing before, or continue on some path we were doing for the last couple of years, that's probably not going to be radically different enough from what you were doing to address the moment now and going into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Peloton and the whole kind of exercise industry is a really good kind of example to give there, and how, especially in how some industries have just completely transformed, and how that must change the game plan entirely for some companies is quite kind of eye-watering, for lack of a better word to think about. So yeah, I think that's another fascinating trend. And there's this, I love the way this is put in the Global Consumers Trends report, of this next trend, which is customers will stop engaging unless you take action. It would just be interesting to hear your thoughts on kind of what some of the actions are that brands are taking.
Yeah, so it's great. I love talking about some of our reports without like digging into the data too much, because I know like when you start talking like data points here and data points there, it gets boring for an audience, right? They don't want spouting data. But one data point I will throw out there is that 63% of consumers think that businesses need to do a better job of listening to their feedback, right? So 6 out of 10 consumers say they need to listen better. So I think clearly one of the very important things, the actions that they need to take, is to really understand what their consumers want and need them to do, what their customers want and need them to do, and also what their employees want and need them to do. And so I think the actions they need to take are things like, we need to reassess what do our consumers want to do online and in person? They need to reassess. One of the things I oftentimes talk about is that they need to relook at what their segmentation and value models are, right? So if we continue on this theme, one of the things that happens, and it doesn't happen very often, right, is that people start, and we saw this out of COVID, people started to have a different view of what they considered valuable, what they got out of it, right? Whether we stick with the exercise industry, or we go into entertainment, or we talk about travel, right? What people see as valuable and important has shifted somewhat. So one of the actions that I think companies need to take is they need to relook at their segmentation model, get more feedback from customers, figure out, are there different segments now? What's driving value differently? And then they have to innovate on those, right? And really drive their experience design efforts to create new experiences that match those new segments and their new view on what value means to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great example, especially kind of considering, if we go back to our last point about how the pandemic has changed people, just think over the past 2 years of how much those segments will have changed and how that could impact the business strategy in so many ways. I think that's again really fascinating. Yeah, and just moving on now, I guess, to our fourth and final trend. And this one is also put very well, and that is kind of treat people as people and not commodities. And just from kind of the way that that is put, it makes me think that the question that I want to ask you is, with this increasing focus on data in the CX world, we're always kind of hearing about data and hyper-personalization and all the strategies that stem from having good access to data. Does your research perhaps show that maybe this human factor is becoming lost in CX?
Yeah, so I think that, and I love that question, right? Because in the ideal world, like we'll put the ideal world out there. In the ideal world, companies are getting better insights and better data and translating that into humanizing what they do even more, right? But I don't think that always happens. I do think that if we get a lot of data, there's a human tendency for leaders and companies to look at that data as the endpoint, right? So, maybe our data shows that, our target customer has, 2.5 kids and likes to go to, Peloton 1.5 times for every 2 times they go to a gym. Well, that's a great description, but it doesn't actually represent any single human being, right? So I do think it's critical for us to take our rich, deeper insights that we're getting, whether it's through experience data like feedback or discussions in contact center or social media, wherever we're getting what we call experience data, which is an understanding specifically how people are thinking and feeling at scale, and then moving that with our operational data, like who are these people, what do they own, what have they done with this, right? We need to get all of that insight and then ask the question, who is the person we're dealing with, and what do they need, and how do we help them? So we oftentimes talk about the notion of design personas, which are how do we understand groupings of people, right, based on the insights we have about their experience data and operational data. How do we better understand groups of people so we can describe them and focus our energies on their specific needs? So it's oftentimes a good transition between all of this data and insights we're getting and sort of designing things that meet the specific needs of a group of people who are human beings, right? Right. At the end of the day, they're not data points. They're not segments. They're not you know, opportunities for growth. They're human beings, and whatever we can do to bridge between our rich insights and the needs of individual human beings is an important step we need to take.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that kind of shows that perhaps my question should have been, how can we use the data to kind of maximize the human factor? Because there's definitely, as you also said, there's lots of parallels that you can draw, and I guess a major part of the art of CX, if you will, is kind of drawing those together. And I think lots of great insights there again. And just kind of one final question I wanted to ask you now, and that was kind of, what we talked about this a little bit at the beginning as well, but what do you think the report tells us about the current state of CX overall?
We have a long way to go. I think you did a nice job of describing your metaphor of the train, right? With Amazon in the front, some frantically trying to keep up, others falling behind, right? I think that what the report shows is that consumers don't feel, by and large, like their needs are being met, and so I think that tells us that the people in the back of that train, right, in the middle of the train, need to go faster. Or what will happen is the back of the train will just be cut off, and those parts of the train, the companies that aren't keeping up at all, will just disappear. Right? Because if we just follow the logic that we see here, right, that consumer needs are changing, consumers are being more and more are focusing more and more on what they want from experiences, and their expectations are growing. So in that environment, you either are continuing to keep up, at least to some degree. I don't think everyone needs to be Amazon. Not everyone needs to be the front of that customer experience train, right? There's only room for a few people at the front, but you can succeed by just continuing to keep up at some level. But to your train metaphor, I think the train gets cut off over time with those companies that just aren't able to sustain a good, solid focus on customer experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great place to end today's conversation. But Bruce, it was great talking to you. Learned a lot from today's conversation. So I appreciate you taking the time to speak to me.
Thank you, Charlie. Really enjoyed it.
Excellent. Yeah, and what I will say to everybody before we end this chat is to check out the 2022 Global Consumer Trends Report. Make sure you go to Qualtrics' website and check out their resources. But yeah, thank you everybody for watching. Bye for now.